about benchmarks today. Hi, everyone. We're so excited to talk about benchmarks today. I'm Madeline Stanionis. I'm a partner here at M&R, and we are so delighted to welcome you to this year's benchmark study. It's our 16th benchmark study, and it's my 10th. We have nearly 1,000 folks who have registered for today's journey, which might be a record for us. And speaking of records, if you have a favorite road trip song or travel theme song, do put it in the chat. We're going to end up today not only with sending you a recording of this webinar, but we'll also include the road trip playlist. So please, please, please feel free to drop those in the chat. So first things first, if for some reason you managed to join this call today without knowing about M&R, well, you should know that we're an agency that works with nonprofits to advance your missions through advocacy, fundraising, organizing, media relations, and pretty much every other way that we can think of. We're deep in this work for those of you who are calling in from nonprofits and those of you who are calling in from other consultants. We are all in this together. And here at M&R, we are wild about sharing everything that we learn with our community, which is why we produce benchmarks every year. Our goal is to provide information and data to help us all do our level best to alleviate suffering and create a better and kinder world for all. And as you can imagine, producing benchmarks is a Herculean effort. And every year we say, do we really want to do it again? And every year we say yes. And two of the people who've been saying yes to this project for a whole lot of years, including this year, and do so much of the heavy lifting are here today to present benchmarks. The first is Teresa Bugeaud, who is M&R's Director of Data Analytics and leads the team of folks who are collecting, crunching, working through, eating, sleeping, and breathing the data that you submit. And the second is Will Valverde, who's our Senior Creative Director, who is the person that authors the text that goes along with the data. And if you really love all of the puns that show up in benchmarks every year related to the theme, thank Will Valverde. And if you don't like them, you should blame me because I'm the one who always says more puns, more puns. So thank you, Will and Teresa. And I'm going to turn it over to Will to kick us off.
Thanks, Madeline. Yes, Passport to Success is not, I think, my finest work, but Madeline thought that we needed to really nail the passport theme here. So there you go. Thanks everybody again for joining us today. I want to start by just laying out some of the foundational stuff so you can have the right context for what we're going to be talking about today, which is going to be like a lot of charts. So first, what we have here is a breakdown of our participants by sector. We have 187 participants this year. Thank you so much to everybody who submitted data, who answered our questions, and who participated. We don't have data without participants, and without the data, we don't have benchmarks. It's just us making stuff up. As we go through the charts, you're going to see that the data is typically broken down along these lines. So this gives different metrics for different sectors. Sometimes you'll see a sector disappears from a chart. When that happens, it's because we didn't have enough data from enough participants within that sector for that metric to give a reliable average. If you find that that keeps on happening for your sector or a sector you're interested in, the best thing you can do is participate and encourage your peers to do the same next year. The more participants we have, the more we're able to consistently report the data. If you're not sure which sector you land within, you can look up the full list of participants at mrbenchmarks.com. That's mrbenchmarks.com. It has all the charts and all the information, even more than we're able to cover today.
Speaking of what we're going to cover today, we are leaving room at the end for questions and answers. But if you have a question during the webinar, please feel free to use the question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen. It says Q&A on it. Please feel free to use that. That's the way that we'll see the questions easiest without having to scroll through all the chat. If you simply have a comment, a great song that you want on a playlist, or anything else, or a travel pun, please put that in the chat. Question and answers go in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. Thank you.
And heckling, you can do out loud, but you're all muted, so that's on you. Okay, in addition to the sector breakouts, we also break out our metrics by size. When we're talking about nonprofit size, for the context of benchmarks, small refers to nonprofits that have an annual online revenue under $500,000. Between $500,000 to $3 million online revenue over the course of 1 year, that puts you into the medium category. And then large are any nonprofits that have annual online revenue over $3 million. Whenever we talk about average, unless we say otherwise, we are talking about the median figure. That means half of the groups who reported data fell below that number, half were above that number. The reason we do median instead of mean is just to make sure that we don't have one or two outliers that have really extraordinary results, either good or bad, that sort of drag that average and gives a misleading picture. And then finally, when we're talking about year-over-year changes, we are talking about historical data from this year's participants. So as Madeline said, this is our 16th annual benchmark study. We're not looking at the 15th when we're producing this data because it's a different pool of participants. And so we want to make sure that we really have good apples to apples comparisons. So year-over-year trend data is all based on this year's participants. So with all of that sort of background out of the way, let's talk about some actual figures. We're going to be going through the major data sections one by one. If you're primarily interested in email, you're going to get a lot of data you can use by email. If you want to know what's going on with digital ads, you'll get that too. We are going to cover everything in detail as much as we can. But the truth is, these different channels overlap in all sorts of ways, and especially the experiences of supporters. Supporters don't generally define themselves as like, I'm an email subscriber who sometimes gets served retargeting ads. That's not, we may see them that way, but that's not how they experience it. They experience a holistic relationship with the cause that they support. So it can be helpful and we hope interesting to take a look at what is happening across the board. The headlines for us this year are largely about sort of a return to normal, kind of normal-ish. We've had some really volatile years in terms of digital programs recently over the last few years. The pandemic really was the driving force behind all the data reported last year for 2020. As a simple measure, we saw really extremely fast growth in online revenue for a lot of nonprofits over 2020. And then last year, the rate of change slowed way down and we sort of solidified those gains. So total online revenue grew by 3% over the course of 2021, which is a modest growth figure, but it's building on that really runaway growth that we saw the year before. In 2021, we also saw some long-term trend lines sort of reassert themselves. Monthly giving continues to be the main source of growth for nonprofits. We saw email list sizes increase by 7%. These are sources of stability for a lot of nonprofits in really uncertain times. Peeling back one layer, let's take a closer look at that 3% revenue increase. So obviously, if you look here at the sector breakout, that growth is not evenly distributed. On the top there, we see the cultural sector increased revenue by 27%. Hunger and poverty nonprofits reported a 32% decline in revenue from 2020. And to be clear, this is not because like fundraisers in that sector forgot to do end of year campaigns or something. They didn't just like not do fundraising in 2021. A lot of what we're looking at is the broader context in which these nonprofits are operating. And that is heavily influenced by the pandemic over the last couple of years. We can see it more clearly if we look back more than 1 year. So what we're looking at here is a 4-year window based on 2017 revenue. The top bar in each of these little set groups of charts shows the growth or the change from 2017 to 2018. The next line down shows the 2017 to 2019 change, and so how much growth happened over the course of those 2 years, and so on. And so what we see is that culturals really had a slow pace of change through 2020. Which for museums and other institutions that face closures and other barriers to people coming to visit them through that first pandemic year, that makes a lot of sense, right? It feels very intuitive. So you can think about 2021 as sort of being a bounce back year, some recovery of that sort of lost growth that didn't happen. You might notice that we are missing in this group of charts the hunger and poverty sector. This is the sector that showed that 32% decline from 2020 to 21. The reason that we don't have it on this chart is because it kind of breaks the chart. In 2020, this sector suddenly shot up to a 428% increase over that 2017 baseline. So this really extraordinary outpouring of support during that first year of the pandemic. As people saw the very real need in their communities, as media reported long lines at food banks, all of that sort of thing, donors really responded. That kind of a spike in giving is really difficult to maintain. And so even with really great retention programs, all the efforts that groups in the sector attempted, it's not unusual to see things kind of come back to earth a bit when we see that really sharp spike in growth. And that's what we see here over the course of 2020 and 2021. It's not that hunger and poverty sector forgetting how to do fundraising in 2021. the sector still reported by far the greatest change over that longer window of time. There are still such outliers, even including the decline last year, that it's hard to sort of even look at them in the same context as everybody else, because the scale of change over that 4-year window is so extreme. So we're going to keep on digging into those fundraising numbers a little bit more deeply here. Again, I mentioned this, we've been talking about it. Online revenue was up by 3%. Monthly giving is really what drove that growth. Average gifts were a bit higher in 2021, $125 for one-time gifts, $25 for monthly gifts. It's nice when it's a really like clean math right there. It's just 5 times larger. You stick around for 5 months, that's the same as one-time gift. And then retention is incredibly important. It's really similar, the retention figures, to what we've been reporting in recent years. 36% overall retention rates, much higher retention for people who had a prior history of repeat giving. We're going to look at that a little bit more closely in a second. Okay, so we actually saw a slight decline by 1% in one-time revenue from 2020 to 2021. At the same time, monthly giving revenue was up by 24%. So that's really where the growth happened last year. It happened in monthly giving. You can focus in on the sectors that are most relevant to you. Those are on the right side there. I want to focus our attention on the breakouts by size. That's the bottom left of the chart here. So remember, for our purposes here, a large nonprofit has online revenue over $3 million over the course of the year. And for groups in that sector, at that size, we saw flat, no change in one-time giving, and 28% increase in monthly giving. So pretty strong growth there. Medium nonprofits, those are between $500,000 and $3 million in online revenue over the course of a year. They saw a slightly larger drop in one-time giving, slightly smaller gain in monthly giving. And then we can look at small nonprofits. So these are groups that are raising under $500,000 online over the course of a year. And they track the overall averages really closely. So a small, actual 1% increase in one-time giving, and then 27% increase in monthly, really strong growth in monthly giving. And I think that's really exciting because it shows that supporters are willing to make that kind of a commitment to some of these smaller nonprofits. It shows that small nonprofits are pursuing the kinds of strategies, the kinds of creative that build that monthly donor base over time. And that kind of reliable revenue is incredibly important, especially for groups that may not have the kind of resources that it takes to do really aggressive, big investments in acquisition all of the time, continually. So having that stable growth base of monthly donors growing over time, super exciting. I'd love to see smaller nonprofits having that robust monthly program because it means so much. Monthly giving made up 22% of all online revenue in 2021. That was up from 16% of the total revenue in the year before. So as long as we keep on seeing that growth in monthly giving outpacing the growth in one-time giving, we're going to continue to see monthly giving as a percentage of the overall revenue eating up a bigger piece of that pie. So we do see big differences by sector here. Culturals remain very reliant in one-time giving, and public media reported that nearly half of all revenue came from monthly giving. So again, part of this is just about the nature of these nonprofits. Public media has invested in the idea of recurring giving, making that pledge, doing those pledge drives for years and years and years, since before digital channels were a thing. And you see that tradition sort of paying forward here. This is a little bit of a different chart. So what we're looking at here is the percentage by each month of how much revenue of the year's revenue came in during that month. Darker cells represent a higher percentage. So if you see dark spots, that's going to be a bigger percentage of annual revenue in that month. We have the overall numbers at the top row, sectors in each row below that. So what we see here, the thing that jumps out, in case you didn't know, December is actually a very important month for online fundraising. A quarter of all revenue came in during that month in 2021. And for most sectors, November was the second highest month. There were a couple of blips in other sectors. Cultural saw more giving in June and July, which may reflect more visits, more attention during those summer vacation months. Hunger and poverty groups started off the year with sort of abnormally high relative giving. It's not like a dramatic change, but you do see a little bit more there. It may be a seasonal thing. It may also be the sort of residual momentum from 2020. We already saw a really big year in 2020. Some of that may have carried forward into 2021 before sort of fading away. So I think the big takeaway here is that you should absolutely continue to send fundraising emails in December. And Giving Tuesday, it looks like in November, is also really contributing to some of the growth here. Okay, so really quick, last couple of simpler, easier to understand kind of contextual things here for fundraising. First, revenue per donor per year was $208 overall, a good bit higher than the 170 the year before. So each donor contributed on average $208. The average donor made 2.7 gifts over the course of 2021. And just a quick note here, because this can get confusing. We are only counting the first monthly gift here for sustaining donors. That way, we're not trying to make comparisons between a sustainer who joined in January and made 12 gifts, somebody who joined in October and only made 3. This allows us to sort of put them on an even footing. So what we're really looking at here is each choice to give. So we're not counting those 12 times that somebody made 12 monthly gifts. These are individual decisions. I'm going to click the donate button. 2.7 times is the average number of times that a donor did that over the course of the year, which is up a little bit from the year before. Average gift for one-time donors was 125. We do see some variations by sector here, but that is across the board for most sectors an increase from the previous year, where the overall average is 111. For monthly giving, the average gift was $25. This is pretty much the same as what we saw the year before. Again, really extraordinary outliers here in the hunger and poverty sector, where we saw over $40 as an average gift for both 2020 and 2021. That's great. Keep doing that. Okay, and then the last thing we really want to think about when we're talking about those overall fundraising numbers is retention. Overall, 36% of 2020 online donors made a gift again online in 2021. To be really clear, this is strictly online to online retention. So we're not counting folks who may have retained in other channels, somebody who made a direct mail gift in 2020 and then gave online in 2021. We don't have access to that full data set, so we don't get to report on it. You should absolutely keep track of that cross-channel retention, but we just don't have the data. And what we see is that prior donors, and these are donors who gave before 2020, they gave in 2020, they retained at higher levels. 60% of them came back again in 2021 to make another gift. For those who made their first gift to a nonprofit in 2020, just 23% of them came back. So the precise numbers are different across different sectors, but the basic shape of things tends to be really similar. And this is something that's been really consistent since we've started reporting this metric in benchmarks. You can see really clearly that developing that habit of giving, once it's locked in, it's really important and really can impact your retention and through there, your revenue. So the long-term impact of that is really huge. We're going to take a minute to talk about email metrics. So I love email. I've written several emails over the course of my career, and I think the data that we have this year is actually really exciting. Let's talk about it. So first, list sizes were up by 7%. And we need that list growth, because email, as much as I say that I love it, email fundraising is actually very hard. For every 1,000 email appeals that landed in inboxes, nonprofits raised $78. And like I said, as a person who's written many of these emails, this number is such a reality check about what it actually takes to build a program, what it actually takes to raise revenue. Sending out 1,000 emails, getting $78 back. It's so much work to get $78. Another way of looking at it, the average response rate for a fundraising email was 0.08%. That means that 1 in every 1,250 recipients of a fundraising appeal actually completed a gift on average. The other 1,249, they did not. We'll have to try again, maybe get them next time, send them more, and try to reach some other channels. But it's a lot of work to make these fundraising emails and make an email program itself successful. But that's actually not what I wanted to talk about mostly. This is the thing that I want to talk about. We're going to focus on the fundraising growth here. Most of this looks pretty routine to my eyes. This is something, these numbers feel familiar. We have slight declines in response rate, page completion rate, and click-through rate. And that's not unusual. Email fundraising, like I said, very hard. And when you've got solid list growth, you often experience these dips in specific metrics. And that's not unusual. But then if you look at the open rate column there on the left, open rates for fundraising messages were up by 26% year over year. And so what these numbers suggest on the surface is that way more people were opening messages, but fewer people were clicking and making gifts. And that feels wrong. And I think it feels wrong because it is wrong. Open rates have always been one of the less reliable metrics that we have. Less reliable than some other metrics because we can't track them directly. Completed gift, you know if somebody either gave or didn't give. An open is not something we can track directly. It's marked when a user downloads a tracking pixel, which means we're not measuring the open directly. We're measuring the download of that tracking pixel. Last year in the fall, Apple rolled out a new OS, and the default privacy settings made it so that all emails the user receives are marked as open. And lo and behold, open rates went up a lot last year. This is tricky since we don't have the breakdowns by operating system for user. We're having to do some sort of speculation here and really sort of exploring it. But we did do some comparisons that I'm not going to go into depth here. They're in the full benchmark study, which once again, mrbenchmarks.com, you can get all of this and more. A deeper look at that story. And having looked at all of that, looked at it as many ways as we can, we feel really confident that the Apple changes are actually a part of the story of why these numbers look so weird, where the open rates are going way up while everything else isn't really doing that. The upshot of all of that is that open rates are probably not the metric that you should be using to gauge the success of your program or of a particular email message. We've always treated it as less trustworthy than some other metrics, and I think we probably have to get used to looking askance at the metric even more than we have been, like very askance. Okay, so that's the overall look at email and fundraising. It's a lot of me saying numbers at you, and I appreciate everybody who's trying to follow along. I know this is a lot to take in at once. We have the luxury of weeks and weeks of trying to make sense of all of this, and then we kind of dump it all on. So thank you. And I know those numbers are mostly why we're here, but we did want to open things up a bit and talk not just about what the data is, but what it means for our programs, how we can use this to move our causes forward. So we've got a couple of M&R folks here to offer some thoughts and ask some questions, and I'm going to start with Madeline.
Right on. Thanks, Will. A couple things. One, lots of folks have been asking questions in the Q&A feature, and so we're going to answer some of those live. So remember, put your comments and answers to questions in the chat, and throw your questions in that little thing at the bottom middle of your screen that says Q&A, and that way we can be sure to get to those. And while I'm just talking for a few minutes, Will and Teresa and Laura Clavon, who is M&R webinar up at the top of your screen, is from our marketing program here at M&R, and they'll be answering some of those questions in the Q&A chat as well. So one of the things that Benchmarks does is it tells us what we are seeing. It does not tell us why. And if there's anything we've learned is that it's really difficult to not start making assumptions why, but the benchmarks study just says what, but there's lots of why. And so one of our first things, and we'll mention this a bit at the beginning, was that we think the data this year so far from what you've seen indicates a bit of a correction of sorts from the previous mercurial year that we had, the first year of COVID. Would you agree? Is that something you saw in your program? And again, this is for the chat. We'll have live question answer where you can actually talk and use your voice at the end of presenting the data. Any thoughts on if it's a correction? No one has a single thought, which is cool. Cool. Okay, thank you, Maggie. Maggie says that sounds right. It's always nice to be sure. For those of us who follow benchmarks, we love a mercurial year because we're like, wait till you see benchmarks this year, y'all. And this year was a year where we're like, oh yeah, benchmarks. This seems about right. This seems kind of normal, our technical term that we've been using. The other thing that seems really true here is that despite all of the changes in email, it seems to us that email remains really critical for everyone's program. One thing that we don't see in benchmarks here is the amount of people who donate that don't necessarily donate via email, but donate because they're on your list. They're seeing email, they might be seeing ads, they might be getting direct mail. So it's hard to always source things to email. Attribution is hard in general, as we all know. But one of the things that this seems is really true is you can't take your eye off of it. And what we see in a lot of the clients that we work with is a little bit, it can get boring. Well, it's Mother's Day again. We're going to do a Mother's Day campaign. It's the same thing we've always done. And I'm not just saying this because I too write a lot of email, but because it's just true, is it's paying attention to what's new. What are we talking about? How are we talking about it? How do we keep our email fresh and different and really worth reading? It seems really clear that that's something that the fundraising data is telling us. And then another observation that we had is that monthly giving is clearly continuing to rise and rise. And we think that's because more organizations are preferencing monthly giving on their donation forms. We certainly do that with a lot of our clients. Is that something that you have seen in your own programs? Are there other reasons that you see monthly giving going up? Any reasons in your own organizations that you might see monthly giving going up? Yeah, interesting. Matthew in the chat says that donors' tastes and preferences have evolved. They're more comfortable subscribing to Netflix and Disney, and et cetera. That is something that some of our staff surmised as well, is that there's just been more of an attention to these subscriptions, a way of interacting with things that you care about. So that is something that some of our, and interestingly, Lisa, you pointed out younger donors, and that is like, I noticed when our own staff was chatting that the younger people on our staff were more likely to say that. So a bunch of other reasons saying why that might be the case. And if you are our client, you know that we have spent a lot of time talking about monthly giving and how to increase it, obviously for the reasons that we just mentioned, but incentive to reduce direct mail, increasing our sustainer asks and channel opportunities. So lots of stuff in the chat. The chat is really good. Y'all should copy and paste the chat into your own notes at some point. Understanding that. And a couple of questions I just wanted to answer live that Cosmo Lee, hi Cosmo, not answerable in today's call, he thought, but maybe we could try. I'm curious if there's any correlation between average gift size and inflation. If everything costs more now, is a $125 gift today comparable to 100 gifts several years ago? That's not something that Benchmarks answers, but it is I think there are other studies that might look at inflation related to giving, the big giving study that happens every year. That might be a place where that gets answered. Any comments or questions from Will or Teresa? Nah? They're like, please don't call on me.
I do not understand the economy. I don't know. No, I think that's interesting. We hadn't really considered that. I don't think inflation has been quite that rapid, so I don't think that's the only thing going on. We typically do see stronger results when the economy is strong in a sense that people feel comfortable giving. And so when the stock market goes down, it's not uncommon to see giving go down as well. People just feel uncertainty, even if their sort of total assets haven't changed all that much. So I think the broader economic context is absolutely a part of what we're seeing here, but we don't have a specific answer to that.
Yeah, and the continued uptick in monthly giving is not universal. I see some of the folks in the comments saying that monthly giving is also something that hasn't necessarily been successful for some organizations. And it is hard. And one of the things that we'll talk about, especially when it comes to ads, is that the ability to test into a monthly giving ask that really works for your audience is difficult to do if you have a smaller audience in particular. And also worth revisiting, since again, this subscription culture means there's more competition for that monthly amount that people are contributing, whether it's to Netflix or to you. There is some people are getting a lot of benefits from some of those monthly payments that they're making. So there may be something there as well. One last thing I want to add, and then we're going to move on to membership and ticket sales organizations. Carla Capers, our friend at Union of Concerned Scientists, it broke a sacred rule that we have in Benchmarks, which is we don't compare the two benchmark study to each other. Carla asked, I know the trend data looks at this year's study participant data from this year and last year. So we aren't comparing two studies, but Carla could not help but notice that last year's average response rate to advocacy messages was 3.6% and this year's is 1.8%, which is a big drop. Again, Carla, I'm just going to say it again, do not compare the studies. These are different groups in the studies. So for all we know, all the groups in the studies continued to go up from last year's study. So you can't compare them. And Teresa, do you want to?
Yeah, I just want to add one quick note. Carla, depending on what version you look at, there was a mistake reporting. It's such an eagle eye, Carla. There was a mistake reporting the advocacy response rate last year in one version. So I think the print version may have had the mistaken one. The old website had it, but we can send you an updated chart from last year. It was much more in line with what we saw this time.
But still don't compare study to study. You can't do it.
Same.
Don't do it. Okay,
but
Carla?
Yes, but good eye, Carla.
It's good for everyone to know that. I think we're going to move on to membership and ticket sales.
Great. So this includes data on both email and fundraising. So it kind of combines a little bit what we've been talking about already. So really quickly on what we mean by membership and ticket sales, because they mean different things to different organizations. When we say membership for the purposes of benchmarks, we mean membership that comes with tangible benefits. So the kind of membership where you get a t-shirt or a tote bag or a water bottle, a magazine subscription, the kind of membership where you get a year's admission to the museum, that kind of thing. We're not talking about the kind of more symbolic membership offers where you might get like a paper card in the mail, but that's all you get. You don't get like additional tangible benefits. So we're not looking at those. When we're talking about ticket sales, we are looking at tickets sales to regular ongoing kind of situations. So a museum, a zoo, that kind of a thing. As opposed to a one-off event like a gala, you may be selling tickets to that, but we're not taking a look at that here. That's sort of its own sort of thing. So a lot of what we're talking about here, really, when we talk about membership and ticket sales, especially in the cultural sector, is exactly the kind of thing that really felt the impact of the pandemic. Member revenue declined from 2019 into the first year of the pandemic for cultural nonprofits, went down. And I think the simplest thing to do there is just think about all the places that were just sort of suddenly closed to the public. So even if they were open in pre-vaccine times, they may not have had people sort of comfortable going to them in the earlier part of 2020. As the situation changed into 2021, we saw really strong growth in that member revenue. Some of that is a general return to people being able to travel safely, but we also can't ignore the efforts of nonprofits that they made to adapt the membership offers. Some of them canceled the expiration of memberships to sort of carry things forward as they were not able to welcome visitors. A lot of them tried new promotions, they developed new creative. A lot of that effort, I think we really saw pay off into 2021 with that really robust growth in membership revenue. You can contrast that with public media, where we did see this big jump from 2019 to 2020, 40% growth almost, and then a leveling off into the next year. And in that sense, like that looks like a decline, like it's not as strong, but really that's tracking what we already saw in the overall revenue numbers, roughly sort of similar changes over the course of those 2 years. And so that's probably less because public media can be enjoyed anywhere you are, not just going to a physical location, the way the museum might work. They were not affected in such a direct way by those pandemic closures and that sort of thing. Ticket revenue really fell off in 2020. And again, you cannot separate that from the pandemic. This revenue did start to recover last year, but it still has a ways to go to get back to pre-pandemic levels. Hopefully we'll see this continue to rise as time goes on, but that 62% decline in ticket revenue in the first year of the pandemic, I think can't be explained by really anything else besides that people just not being able to or not being willing to go and attend physical locations. And here we are comparing membership emails from and non-membership appeals. So these are for organizations that do regular fundraising and also do membership appeals. This is what the contrast looked like. And across the board, we see much stronger metrics for membership appeals. This may be partly because members' offers are just more attractive to supporters. They come with the subscription or the annual ability to attend the museum or whatever it might be. Those kinds of programs may also be more expensive for a nonprofit to fulfill. So there's a little bit of a cost benefit analysis there that needs to be done. It's also important to note that the audiences for these two kinds of messaging might not be the same. And so nonprofits may be targeting membership offers at folks that they think are more likely to give. And some of those fundraising messages may be going out to members who feel like they've already given that year and may be less inclined to respond to a fundraising appeal. So a little bit of this is probably about the audience and some of the strategic choices rather than strictly membership messages do better. I don't think it's quite that simple. Now, when we compare membership to ticket offers, we see some similarities. So we see pretty similar click-through rates. So this is the percentage of people who click through. Oh, and we had a question about this that I'm just going to answer now about what we mean by some of these metrics. I should have explained them. So the open rate is the percentage of people who receive a message and open it, which we can't trust, as we talked about. The click-through rate is the percentage of people who received an email and clicked on the link to go donate or go take action. Page completion rate is the percentage of people who land on that landing page, whether it's a donation page or an action page, and actually complete the process. So they actually finished making their gift. Response rate sort of encompasses all of those things. It is the percentage of people who received an email who did the thing that we're asking them to do. So it's influenced by all those other factors. Okay, so what I was saying is the click-through rates are pretty close, 1.5%, 1.3%, not that different. And then membership landing pages 14% of the people who get there actually complete their membership gift. For ticket sales, it's just 5.2%. So the completion rate, that almost 95% of people who landed on that ticket sales page came really close to buying a ticket and then chose not to for whatever reason. They just walked away. And when we see people get that close to doing the thing and then they walk away, to me, that looks like a really great opportunity for retargeting ads. We want to be following those people around and continue to give them offers and tempt them to come back and continue that ticket purchase, which is an excellent segue because we're going to be talking about digital ads next. So I'm going to hand it over to Teresa.
All right. Thanks, Will. All right. So first up for me is digital ads. I'll be digging into most of these points in the next few slides, but here are some of the main points about digital ads. Overall, last year's nonprofits increased their spending in digital ads by 19%. They spent about 6 cents for every dollar that they raised in overall online revenue. We'll talk about some of the differences in the budgets for large and small nonprofits, and the cost per click across different channels was in a pretty narrow range, and we'll dig into those numbers too. The return on ad spend, or ROAS, varied a lot based on fundraising channel. And the view-through revenue for digital ads made up about 35% of digital ads giving. Okay, so to jump into digital ads, let's first look at this from the perspective of an example nonprofit. So first, they need to decide what's their overall budget. On average, nonprofits spent 6 cents in digital ads for every dollar that they raised in online revenue. Now, remember, that's not a return on investment. This is their spending relative to what they raise online overall. So as an example, if a nonprofit raised $1 million online, they had a digital ads budget of $60,000. But that said, there's a really big difference between small nonprofits and large nonprofits here. So small nonprofits invested just 2 cents per dollar that they raised online. And for large nonprofits, it was 8 cents per dollar. So that means that the average large nonprofit spent 4 times as much as a small nonprofit relative to their total online revenue. That's a really big difference in these budgets. So that difference between large and small nonprofits, it also carried over to the year-over-year changes. You can see big differences here between the size of organizations and how much they changed their digital ads budget year over year. So overall, from 2020 to 2021, nonprofits increased their digital ads budgets by 19%. Large nonprofits were pretty much in line with that, with a 20% increase. But small nonprofits, they actually decreased their investment year over year by 6%. And you can also see there's a really big difference between sectors as well. The cultural sector in particular stands out. They spent almost 300% more in 2021. And there are much smaller increases and even decrease there too in public media within other sectors. So there was big changes year over year. So back to thinking about that example nonprofit. After they've decided their overall budget, they then need to decide how they're going to prioritize spending. So one way to look at that is by looking at advertising goal. So in 2021, the majority of digital advertising spending was for direct fundraising asks, with just over half of budgets going to direct fundraising asks, 52%. Branding and awareness and education advertising was 32% of budgets, and lead generation was just 15% of budgets, with 1% going to other types of advertising. Again, we see a lot of variation here in organization size. Large nonprofits were very similar to the overall numbers, but the small groups, they dedicated much more budget to fundraising and far less to branding, awareness, and education, with almost 3/4 of their budget going to fundraising and only 14% to branding, awareness, and education. And the differences continue between organizations when we look at advertising channels for their direct fundraising budgets. So this is just for the ads that have the goal of direct fundraising. Here, search was the most important channel for small nonprofits, with 53% of their fundraising budgets. So just half of their budgets went to search, or just over half went to search. But large nonprofits were a bit more balanced. For those groups, social was the largest channel, with 37% of their budgets. fundraising at 32, and search at 23. So that was a much more balanced look. The small nonprofits, again, kind of concentrated things in search and then split the rest between display and social media. And this could be for a number of reasons, including how those channels perform. And we'll be looking at the channel performance in a couple slides. So far we've talked about the decisions that nonprofits make, what our example nonprofit decides, how they want to spend their money, why they want to spend it, and on what budgets, or how much to spend. And once the ads are placed, really what matters most is how the audiences respond. So for lead generation, key metric to look at is cost per lead, and that's how much it costs to recruit just one new subscriber. So overall, cost per lead was $3.31. And while small nonprofits, they did report higher costs than larger nonprofits, the most obvious differences here were between sectors. Hunger and poverty nonprofits, they had a cost per lead of $31, which is so much higher than the overall average. One way to interpret that result is to really assume that something went wrong, and we really went through and made sure to look at the data and see if anything was wrong there. Of course, it wasn't. But what we would assume is that something went wrong with the ads, because a lower cost per lead is really generally preferable here to a higher one. But during the pandemic, especially for these hunger and poverty groups, these nonprofits probably found that they could convert these new leads at a high enough rate that even though a cost per lead is $31, still had a good return. So it was still worth heavily investing in this type of growth. And then for fundraising advertising, compared to for lead generation, for fundraising advertising, there's really two key metrics that are closely linked. There's cost per donation and return on ad spend. So this table shows the cost per donation, which is the simpler measure, and that's how much does a nonprofit have to spend to generate one single gift. And the results here really vary by channel. Search had the lowest cost per donation at $46. Social media was higher at $86, and display was $178. So for a nonprofit to get one donation via display, they needed to spend $178 for that donation.
Teresa, we're getting a bunch of questions around does the search or any of the spend and results include the Google Ads grants?
Yes, I can answer that. Let me just make sure, because I feel like we get this often. And we add it specifically as a note to make sure. I believe we ask folks to exclude their Google grants revenue, but I will check that as soon as I can pull up the right document and make sure.
Thanks, Teresa. Sorry to interrupt. Carry on.
No problem. All right. So we talked a bit about cost per donation. On the flip side of that is return on ad spend. The lower the cost to convert a donor, the higher the return on ad spend tends to be. So this is just sort of the inverse metric as that cost per donation metric. We see that relationship most clearly with search, which had the lowest cost per donation for any channel and the highest ROAS. So for every dollar that nonprofits spent on search, they saw a return of $3.72. Display and social media advertising were pretty comparable to each other in terms of ROAS at 59 cents and 57 cents. This was even true with the higher cost per donation for display. So that could be because it's of higher average gift for display, even with that higher cost per donation. And just like with cost per lead, the hunger poverty sector was an outlier for ROAS, but they also had higher returns than any other sector. So that means as the pandemic went into a second year, donors really continued to give to nonprofits that were providing immediate community support. That response to fundraising ads from hunger and poverty nonprofits shows that all of this is important to remember, that we keep it all in context of where this work happens and what's happening in the world around us. As for 2022 and what we can sort of predict we might see with the invasion of Ukraine dominating headlines now, we might see that the disaster international aid sector has these types of metrics next year when we look at the benchmarks report. or other sectors might be influenced by other world events as they occur.
All right. Thank you, Teresa. That was a lot of data, and there are a lot of questions in our chat. I will just tell you, between the chat and the Q&A feature, you have a lot of questions about ads. And so that's the good news is that I brought Liz Erdner, our Senior Vice President, who has been our ads practice area for a long time and knows just about everything about ads. And so, Liz, I think maybe spend a little time just on some of the big recommendations that we've come up with, but then we're gonna answer some of your questions live just right here with Liz Erdner.
Great. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so I think, some of the top takeaways I saw from this year's benchmarks report, as Teresa mentioned, the data really shows for most organizations an increase in investment in ads. And, we see more ads. There's more competition. So testing creative has been mattering more than ever. I think it's a place where more groups I'm seeing are investing in doing message testing to actually test creative ahead of big campaigns and ahead of actually putting paid budget behind it in market, and able to be able to sort of go out with the most effective creative. Madeline, Will and Madeline talked a lot about email. And, as email remains both critical and hard, it's really important for organizations to reach their email subscribers and donors in other channels. So not just thinking about digital advertising as an acquisition channel, but about as another place to really be able to reach people. So, being able to do retargeting ads where you can actually reach folks who might not be reading, opening, or engaging with email, but get to them in another channel to retain and upgrade. And it is a place where we're actually seeing groups spending more on retargeting relative to prospecting in this year's benchmarks. And I think is really important focus for most programs. Lastly, I think, really important to be thinking about how you're diversifying your ad spend, especially those groups with large budgets. There's not a one size fit all media plan for every organization, and what works for some smaller budgets is really going to be different than larger. But I think, when thinking about your investment, industry changes can make it very risky to have most of your media spend tied to one platform. And I think it's something we've seen with, potential volatility with things like Facebook. Social is still really a top performer for a lot of groups, as we saw from benchmarks in terms of the low cost per donor. But, this year we did see that the return on ad spend for display and social were actually neck and neck, and would really be curious to hear from folks here who have been spending in social, especially primarily Facebook, if they're looking to diversify or how they're experimenting with other ads channels and vendors.
We've got a couple questions already, Liz, that I think you might be able to answer.
Yes.
The first is just a good blanket description of what display advertising is. It's new for a lot of folks, and also, as we all know, it's one that's really changing. Liz, maybe talk a little bit about what display advertising includes.
Yeah, so that includes basically, when you are on the internet, on a website, and like the New York Times or weather.com, and you see one of those banner ads, you see a display ad. And I think, the really exciting advancement in like the past 10 or so years with programmatic media buying means that we don't have to buy display by just going directly to a vendor like the New York Times and spend a lot of money on just that placement, but we can actually buy really smartly with real-time bidding and focusing on audiences. So going after certain people whatever website they happen to be on.
And you're bucketing programmatic display with that, right?
Yes,
Liz?
yes.
Right,
yes.
right. So
and then we did break video out into its own category, which would include YouTube or programmatic video vendors.
Great. And then another question around video advertising. What are we including in video advertising? What are the channels that are typically there?
Yeah, Teresa, you might have exactly what we put in the data collection, but I know we were including YouTube spend there, any programmatic video vendors like say Tremor that are just going after video. Anything else specifically, Teresa, that we called out there?
Yes, for Yes, we said if it's a video ad promoted as part of a programmatic ad buy or promoted on YouTube or another video site, include it under video. So it could be anything that's part of their programmatic ad. So I think YouTube's the most common, and then
Yeah.
But it
And then
doesn't mean
if you were running a video, oh, sorry. I was going to say, if you were running a video on Facebook, for example, as your ad, that would be grouped under social, that spend and that performance. Is that what you're going to say, Madeline?
Exactly. One question we have is, do we have any ideas as to why there's such a large gap between sectors in cost per donation in video? Any thoughts on that? Why there would be sector differences?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. It could really, I'm looking for pulling up that data right now. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Madeline.
One thing that it also, it's so subjective, because, if you are watching a video about Ukraine, and you're in the international relief sector, it's going to do a lot better than a sector that's not in the news. So sometimes these are really affected by what news was happening in the moment. Obviously, Ukraine wasn't this year, but the video part really is subject to the currency of the video to a certain extent. And Liz, you probably have something else smart to add to that as well.
Oh, just also that I think video is a place where organizations are starting to diversify budget more and more. So I think overall it's a smaller percentage of spend compared to some of the other channels. So there might be, fewer groups doing a little less there, and that can also really have the performance vary based on what groups are actually out there in video and what they're doing.
But I think it's fair to say, I think it's fair to say if you're a medium-sized organization and video, the cost per donation at over $2,000 may not be your first choice. But I think the part where we're really learning and trying things, you often see really high costs, and then as the market sort of figures out what works in it, then you see those costs come significantly down. So.
Exactly. And to your point, Madeline, like the content matters so much with video, and for the same exact organization, one video fundraising ad can perform extremely differently than another one based on just the actual creative and content and how it works. So the creative makes a huge difference, much more than something like a paid search ad or even like a static social ad from what I've seen.
I'm going to add one more question, and then we got to move on, but there'll be more time for these questions. And again, if you answer in the question and if you put them in the question and answer, we're going to do our best to answer them all for you. So we will get to those. One more question, then we'll move on. And that is from Kelly. Do you see an increase in CPM coinciding with the increase in ad spend? Do we know anything about that?
Yeah. I think, it really depends on where that spend is. For groups with really big ad budgets, they are spending more in places like, in video, and that has higher CPMs generally. I think also where we see CPM really fluctuate is less on the size of the ad spend and more about the audience. If you're actually going after a really refined, specific, smaller audience, like those retargeting audiences can tend to be a lot more expensive because you're going after people who visited your website or who are your donors. And the more you kind of refine and pinpoint that audience or maybe add on third-party data, the higher those CPMs can be and more expensive it can be. But often the performance is better. So really good to look at it holistically.
All right, thanks, folks. Keep those questions coming in the question and answer feature, and we'll do our best to answer them one by one. And we know the ads is a really exciting place to be in right now. It's a little like email was some years ago. Email's still exciting, but it's settled down. It's really about strategy and doing the hard work, whereas ads is changing constantly. And that's why there's lots of folks that are asking questions in the chat about what this acronym means or what is display include. So keep those questions coming. It's a pretty exciting and pretty changing really fast environment right now. We'll move along.
Okay. Sailing into social media. All right, so here are some of our top line points on social media. For every 1,000 email addresses, nonprofits had the most Facebook fans with fewer Twitter and fewer Instagram followers relative to their email list size. Almost all nonprofits that we surveyed were active on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. YouTube and LinkedIn and other platforms were used by fewer, but we'll dig in a little bit more there. On average, nonprofits posted to Facebook 1 time per day. And revenue from Facebook declined by 20% from the previous year. For Facebook fundraisers, the average Facebook fundraiser generated 5 gifts, had an average gift of $35. And we'll dig in more about engagement and Facebook post reach, but each organic Facebook post only reached a small portion of the page's fans. And much of the audience that a post did reach was not already following that nonprofit. Okay, let's dive into some of that. This is a new chart this year for people who are longtime Benchmarks fans. So every single participant in this year's report was reported being active on Facebook, with 97% of groups on Twitter and 95% on Instagram. 75% of the groups use YouTube and LinkedIn. And those are all long-established platforms. They have a large user base, and nonprofits have relied on them for many years. But even though it has a shorter track record, TikTok is now an active platform for 23% of nonprofits. So that's showing how quickly TikTok is rising, showing that nonprofits are trying to reach new, more diverse, younger audiences. Maybe some of them are trying to learn some dances. No other platform was used by more than 10% of nonprofits. And then I just enjoyed this list, but just one participant each reported being active on a handful of other platforms, many of which I've never heard of prior to this survey. Gab, Medium, Parler, Rumble, Spotify, Tumblr, Twitch, and Vimeo also showed up in our survey, but they weren't very popular. So with all that, it's really not a surprise that nonprofits had their largest social media following on Facebook. It's the most well-established. It's been doing things to cater to nonprofits for a number of years. For every 1,000 email subscribers that groups had, they had 376 Facebook fans, 229 Twitter followers, and 141 Instagram followers. Those relative sizes varied widely between sectors. So you can see cultural groups had many more Instagram followers than Twitter fans, and rights nonprofits reported more than twice as many Twitter followers as email subscribers. All that checks out for the type of content that these groups put out. It makes sense that cultural groups want to have photos available on Instagram, and that rights groups have more text content and link content on Twitter. So even though Facebook had the largest overall audience, those audience sizes were basically flat from 2020. Overall, the number of Facebook followers increased by only 1% from 2020 to 2021, while Twitter audiences grew by 5% and Instagram audiences grew by 25%. Now, this is what we've seen in recent years. It's a very similar trend, although these numbers are all pretty much lower than we've seen before. The Facebook audiences really increased at a much slower rate than other platforms. Before I go into the rest of these, I just want to pause for a second and mention that the rest of what I'll be talking about is just reporting on Facebook. Now, that isn't because we prefer Facebook or because more nonprofits are on it, which is true, or anything like that. It's actually just because Facebook makes more data available than Twitter or TikTok or even available from Instagram. So the rest of the data is mostly because of data availability, not because of our preference for reporting Facebook things. In fact, we're always keeping an eye on what data is available, and if anyone ever sees an amazing report coming out of any of those other platforms, please let me know. We would love to report on it. Okay, back to the data. Unlike other channels like email, social media platforms really control who sees what through algorithms. So on Facebook, an organic post by a nonprofit just reached 4% of its fans. So that means the vast majority of a nonprofit's Facebook fans didn't get served an individual post. On the flip side, 30% of the audience that did see the post were not already fans. So we're not just reaching the audiences we already know when we post to social media. And that means it's really important to think about fans and non-fans when you're posting. Really making sure that you're including context because many of the people seeing the post are not actually already following you. In order to explain that reach, many nonprofits rely on, or expand that reach, sorry. Many nonprofits rely on paid post promotion. And in 2021, 2.8% of nonprofit posts had some paid reach. And there's a lot of variation across the sectors, as you can see. So overall, this is types of Facebook posts that groups were posting. You can see the stacks represent the different types. Overall, 35% of nonprofit Facebook posts included a photo content, with hunger and poverty groups using photos in 66% of all their posts. Link posts made up 54% of posts, and 9% of posts included video content. There's lots of reasons why a nonprofit might use one format instead of another. Video might be the best way to communicate the reality of a situation or show a particular spokesperson. In rapid response, a link might be the best way that you can reach supporters and respond quickly. And you can see that in public media. And you can see in the wildlife animal welfare sector that photo posts are really good for sharing photos of kittens and puppies. And 61% of their posts included photos. But social media is about engagement. And so we want folks to click and comment and share. And so while those link posts might take less time to get out in the world, they also tended to have lower engagement score of 0.23% compared to 0.31% and 0.32% for video. Now, let's talk a little bit more about that engagement score. I know I showed it to you before I even explained what it was. So it is our benchmark's way of measuring the success of a given post. So as I discussed earlier, Facebook's algorithm has an overwhelming impact on post reach. It decides who sees your content, and if content gets a massive reach, that can inflate, that can inflate your engagement. So it makes it really difficult to rely on Facebook's reported engagement rates. So what we report for engagement score doesn't rely on reach. It measures the number of users who interacted with a post as a percentage of page fans on the day that the content was posted. So the average Facebook engagement score was 0.21%. So that means that if a nonprofit had 1 million fans and they posted a piece of content, that post will receive 2,100 likes, clicks, and shares on average. And that Facebook engagement score actually increased 23% year over year, with a lot of variation across sectors. A lot of this is, of course, driven by real world events and, of course, driven by the Facebook algorithm and how much people are seeing the content. So you can see folks were less engaged in disaster and international aid organizations in 2021 than they were in 2020, and they were much more engaged with content from wildlife animal welfare groups. So in addition to the type of content, engagement score is also influenced by when that content was posted. So Facebook engagement scores tended to be lowest on Fridays at 0.18%, with Monday and Wednesday content reaching engagement score of 0.23%. Now we can move on from engagement to Facebook fundraising. The amount of revenue processed directly on Facebook declined by 20% in 2021. But it accounted for 1.1% of all online revenue. Almost all that revenue was driven by user-driven, crowd-funded Facebook fundraisers. You can see here for groups in the health sector, 2.3% of their online revenue was generated on Facebook. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the individual Facebook fundraisers created to support nonprofits in those sectors were necessarily more successful than others. The average Facebook fundraiser generated 5 gifts, had an average of $35, average gift of $35. And the differences from sectors are relatively small, and there's actually a relatively small range here too, from the 25th to 75th percentile in those bars. So the key factor for nonprofits who wanted to drive Facebook revenue is really just getting more supporters to start Facebook fundraisers rather than motivating larger gifts or motivating additional gifts to existing fundraisers. But of course, that's easier said than done. And like everything else on Facebook, how well things do really depends on Facebook and its algorithm. This chart shows Facebook revenue by month. Overall, the most important month for Facebook revenue was November, and that's the month where Facebook really prioritizes fundraiser content as part of Giving Tuesday. That's not to say that Facebook completely determines the revenue on the platform. Choices made by nonprofits and by supporters really do matter for these. And so, for example, a disaster international aid nonprofit, saw spikes in Facebook revenue in the spring and in August. And those are driven by real world events that can drive people to start fundraisers and raise more money on Facebook for those organizations. Okay, I think that's it for our social media.
Well, and we have about 1 million questions in the chat and the question and answer. So you'll be glad to know that Linda Capato Jr. is on our call today. Linda is a senior account supervisor in our social media practice area and is a genius. No pressure, Linda. And has a couple of things to share, but Linda, I'm gonna throw some questions at you and at the rest of our team too. So you can go ahead and unmute, and what can people do with all this social media data just to start us off?
Oh, so much. I think for the first bullet on here is most nonprofits can't be on all platforms. And so just to encourage everyone to prioritize the platforms that are best for what you're doing and do them well. So if you're looking for different generational outreach, so you want to reach Gen Z, think about TikTok as opening it up. Obviously, all of the platforms have different generational audiences. And so trying to figure out, who your audience is, who you want to be speaking to and what you do well, that will be a better benefit to you than trying to do everything all at once. This one feels really obvious, but it's always important to say is to keep pushing to deliver as fresh content as possible. Algorithms are constantly changing. Some things that may have worked a year ago or 2 years ago probably aren't going to work as well as they are right now. In my experience, photos were the best things to do, then live were the best things to do. Now links are a little bit better, then back to video. And so just make sure that you're diversifying your content too and being aware of how it's performing so you can continue to get in front of people's screens. Facebook's fundraisers still work. That's very exciting. We're still able to raise some money. I know we dipped a little bit, but this is and can be a pretty low lift in terms of its return. $35 being the average gift is no small sum. And so this is one of the ways that we can really use Facebook to our advantage. I would also just say, one of the big things that I really pulled from a lot of this information is I think we can all assume that Facebook was dying for a minute, but it's really clear that it's still a powerful tool. A lot of folks are really on it and engaging on it. And even though it seems like our paid posts are really getting further out, I saw a question in the chat about why folks are seeing content that are maybe they don't follow a page, and that's because of the algorithm and paid posts. And so folks are getting access to your content even if you didn't mean for them to. Keep on keeping on our big three. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram are really going to carry us forward.
A bunch of people asked a question, Linda, about why Facebook growth is slow and Instagram is so robust. There seems like some obvious answers to that, but maybe just sort of comment on why that is.
Yeah, I think the most obvious answer is algorithm and it just being a little bit more generous on places like TikTok and Instagram, and even Twitter can be generous sometimes when we play nice. Facebook is a little bit more driven by a paid promotion cycle. And so sometimes it can be a little harder for organizations who aren't willing to put a ton of money behind posts for either budget reasons or just interest reasons. It can be a little slower. Also, a lot of people do assume that lots of folks are jumping off of Facebook, and that is actually true. Folks are spending a lot less time on places like Facebook, a little bit more time on image and video driven social media content.
Another question, some of these, the one thing we love about benchmarks is it attracts folks from like the really been doing this for a long time angle and sort of the beginning angle. And so we have questions that sort of reflect all of that. One question I know a lot of people have, and sometimes I have too, which is how are non-fans seeing a post if they're not following us? How does that work?
So the short answer to that is, if I'm following your page and I like one of your posts, it'll show up on a feed if you're following me. And so it's kind of just like the echo chamber of people who follow a post. Everyone else will see what they're doing. That's one part. Another part is often folks are paying for promotion. And so if I'm paying for an ad to be posted on Facebook or promoting a post, the audience is just going to be wider than the folks that follow me. And that's just one of the wonderful features of paid promotion. But in general, the algorithm is set. So on Facebook in particular, and this is true for Twitter as well, if you like a page, your followers will see you interact with the page.
A question from an anonymous attendee. I always wonder, like an anonymous attendee. I always assume that must be a competitor of M&R, in which case you're welcome to be here. Welcome, anonymous attendee. Our organization is getting a lot of pressure to be on TikTok. Do you think this platform will continue to grow? Should we be on TikTok? The eternal question, Linda.
Oh, I love this question. If yes, it will continue to grow. The question about if you should be on it is a soul searching question. I encourage y'all to have an honest conversation internally about who your audience is. I said earlier, it's majority Gen Z folks. And so, there is a party going on that us older millennials and above aren't necessarily invited to. I will say I am also spending the majority of my free time on TikTok. So it is getting a little bit of an older audience now. And it's coming out of this phase as being a kids app for just dancing. There's really incredible political organizing happening there. It's a really powerful tool. So if that is something that you can invest your time in, you have a really good video team or really great like advocacy content, I would encourage you to look into it. It's not going to go away, and the growth is remarkable. And then when you layer on things like paying influencers to work on content and content creators to actually speak to their audience, there's just a huge open space for really cool work.
I'd also like to thank the chat for the great conversation happening over there. Please read. If you want to keep the chat, copy and paste the chat. I think it is included in the webinar when we send it out, but copy and paste the chat into your own Google Doc and to enjoy later. I'm going to close off the questions now. We're going to try and answer the questions that remain in our Q&A form, and we're going to move on to our final section. Thank you, Linda.
Thank you. I also just want to echo, people should be on TikTok. It's really fun. Loving parenting TikTok, honestly. Lots of great content there. All right, website performance. So here are some of our main website performance metrics. One second, there we go. Sorry about that. Screen confusion. Okay, so the majority of nonprofit website traffic came from users on mobile devices, but users on desktop devices made up the majority of donation transactions and revenue. The average gift made on desktop device was higher than for mobile users, and we'll also talk a bit about organic visitors. So on to what is my favorite chart in the study. I always enjoy this chart. For many years of benchmarks, we've reported a consistent trend. Nonprofit web traffic has shifted away from desktop devices and toward mobile. But this year, something weird happened. Desktop share of nonprofit website traffic actually increased by 14% this year, while the mobile share declined. And I encourage you to go to the report and read about all of the things that we explored for why this may have happened, because we have lots of theories. But you can see here that there was an increase, but it still meant that mobile was still 54% of overall traffic. The desktop share of donation traffic and revenue also increased this year by 5% and 4%. That said, the shares all still look similar to what we've seen in the past. More than half of nonprofit website traffic came from mobile devices. I should also note that includes phones and tablets this year. We put those together this time because tablets were such a small portion of the puzzle. But the growth of desktop was a surprise, and we definitely looked into it. So even though desktop users were less than half the traffic, they were still 65% of transactions and 76% of revenue. That means that donation page conversion rates were higher for desktop users than for mobile users, and that desktop users had a higher average gift. So here we can see organic traffic volume as a percent of overall revenue. Organic traffic represented 41% of all nonprofit website visits in 2021. Organic traffic, just to define that means it's visits from users who searched for a term and clicked on unpaid results, as opposed to a search ad where it's a paid result. These are unpaid results, unpaid traffic. So these are users with lots of different motivations for visiting a site. Maybe they saw a news story or they were served an ad, and then they went and searched for the nonprofit. Maybe they were looking up information about visiting a museum or searching for a job. So for those organic users or organic visitors, 0.11% completed a gift, and that amounted to an average of 15 cents of revenue per organic visitor. That means that there is a big opportunity here. So with such a large share of traffic, improving those numbers just a little bit can make a really big difference. And one important place to start to improve those numbers is to make the most out of the main donation page. So the average conversion rate for these pages, for main donation pages, so that's a page, it's most likely the page that's linked on your main page, like donate here. That's what we're looking at when we're talking about the main donation page. The conversion rate for those pages, 17% in 2021. So there was a big range here between the sectors though. And so you can see hunger poverty sector, they far exceeded that rate. Again, this outlier sector with a conversion rate of 47%. So again, for websites, if we're talking about ways to improve these results and see and make shifts, a really important way to do it would be to make sure that these main donation page conversion rates are higher. And then hopefully you can convert more of those organic visitors. All right, that's everything for website, and that was actually the last chart of the presentation.
Amazing. We finished with 11 minutes to spare, which means we can do some of the questions that have been showing up and some of the questions that are in the private chat. So I'm going to go ahead and keep opening that up. So folks, feel free to make comments in the chat and use the Q&A for questions. We've been trying to answer them. Just one question around Facebook engagement score. Does engagement score include promoted content, or is this only organic? I think that might be a question for Teresa. Teresa.
I'm sorry, can you say that
Does
again?
engagement score
yes.
Include promoted content, or is this only organic?
We're looking at all content in this.
So
previous years we've actually excluded paid, but this time we include paid in the engagement score numbers.
I think this is a question for all the panelists. Where do I find dog TikTok?
Just responding to this, you can follow the SD Humane Society, interact with their posts, and comment on their wonderful page of adorable animals, and you'll get a lot more dog TikTok on your page. It does find you, it's true.
This I think is a question for Liz Ertner or Matt Derby. Matt Derby's joined us who is our Senior Vice President in charge of our ads practice area. Is there any data or trends on carousel posts versus single image posts? That I assumed it was an ads question, but I'll let you answer that quickly. Liz or Matt?
Yeah, so when we've tested that before, hi, this is Matt Derby. When we've tested that before, so for paid posts, we have generally found that single image or video outperforms carousel in general. I think a lot of times the carousel ad is intended as a real e-commerce style ad, so there's not a lot of room for text. It's really, it's really good if what you want is a bunch of different products and for someone to scroll through some products and choose the one that they like and then land on that page. It's not as much geared towards, a nonprofit, which maybe has one product, which is a donation. So in general, that's true. However, I do think that sometimes varies. For one, there are a lot of organizations who are running, the gift catalog stuff like buys, and those carousels work really well for that. And I think there's some also really creative ways that people have used them in the past too.
Eric Jost asks, we've seen our Facebook, Twitter engagement and reach plummet this year. Are others seeing the same trend? Any comments on that? I think that might be a question for you, Linda.
Yeah, and I think part of the Facebook plummeting is just an algorithm change. And again, it's another piece of really prioritizing paid content. This is kind of the downside to the shifts that have been happening on Facebook, is that you'll just see a lot more engagement on paid promotions. And that's just been a big piece of this. And again, to reiterate what I had said before, is that in general, people are just spending a little bit less time on things like Facebook. And so you're just going to see a lot less engagement overall. But again, the algorithm shifting, that's a big piece of it. In terms of Twitter, I'm not sure. And I actually want to do a little digging on that, because I haven't, on the accounts that I work with, I haven't seen a huge drop. off of engagement, but it seems like some other folks are seeing some shifts, and I'm seeing the Elon Musk comments already.
We've gotten a couple questions around advocacy and more digging in on advocacy. And, we don't include a ton of advocacy data here. So not nearly like, so for example, we have lots of page completion rates, or well, we have lots of data more data on fundraising than we do on advocacy. And Teresa, I think you might be the person to answer that question, why that is.
Yeah, we would love to include more data on advocacy. The trickiest part is that it's really hard to match up metrics across organizations for advocacy because the goals are often very different, and they are often hard to track if they're like real life goals. And a lot of what people like call advocacy is actually sort of like lead generation with an advocacy like method in a way. And so if we're talking about like advocacy actions like contacting legislators and things like that, the tracking is inconsistent enough across CRMs and just varied so much across organizations that it's really hard for us to compare apples to apples. That said, like it's always one of our first questions that we ask when we're deciding what metrics to include in benchmarks is like, how do we include more advocacy data? Yeah, we always hope to include more. But yeah, it's just such it's a very tricky thing to match up across organizations and programs.
Great. We have just 5 minutes left. A couple questions that have been coming in around the recording. The recording includes the chat. It does not include the question and answer. I'm not certain we'll be able to compile that. So just FYI for those who are asking in the Q&A about that. Any other questions before we wrap up? Any other questions that haven't been answered in the Q&A? We've got still some that are being answered, or anything from my host that you're seeing in the Q&A that you might have wanted to elevate to live. I see a couple things that have come in. Anonymous attendee also asked, Will, I see you're answering this, so I'm going to let you answer this live. Can you explain the email correction you mentioned? From what I have seen, email has fallen in terms of open rate, but your stats suggest they have gone up for the majority of organizations. I'm surprised by the numbers you're reporting. Will, you were typing something, so I'm going to let you say it.
Yes, so I explained this a little bit earlier, but yeah, we think that what is happening is probably the rising open rates are a mirage that is caused by changes in how Apple privacy settings work. But if you are seeing declines in your open rates, I first want to make sure that that is tracking declines in other metrics as well to make sure it's not just something about the way things are being counted. If you are seeing that, then I would be taking a really close look at deliverability and looking in particular if you're seeing some of the email service providers seeing declines. So suddenly you might see AOL or Gmail or Hotmail, I guess people use that, like really fall off a cliff. And if that happens, that's probably about what's landing in inboxes rather than how users are behaving. So that's the place that I would start looking.
Right on. Thanks, Will. And here's an easy question or an easy comment from Mimi Torres. I think this is targeted at Linda, maybe. We've discovered at their nonprofit that photo posts with text overlay don't do as well as just photo posts. Any reasons why that might be, Linda?
So photos with text overlay don't do as well as photos
without text.
Yeah, there tends to be an algorithm disinterest in photos with text on it. I am not sure their rhyme or reason from TikTok. It may be, or I'm sorry, from Facebook. I have TikTok on the brain now, guys. I think there may be a preference in terms of accessibility, or that may have been the change. But we've seen that across the board. There's like it will drop down your post if there's too many words on the image. It's just one of the many quirky things on Facebook.
Right. One of the many quirky things on Facebook. It seems like an inauspicious way to end our webinar. I feel like we should end with something much more grand. And I guess what I'm going to say first is thank you so much for those of you who participated in benchmarks this year. Maybe just say in the chat before we leave if you participated so we can give you a big round of thank you. Anybody here a participant this year? Please out yourself right here. Or if you've been a participant in previous years, perhaps out yourself. The reason that we have all this data to go over today, that we're sharing all of this and that you'll continue to use it, is because of the people that are saying yes right now, this minute. Thank you so much for saying yes to this project that we do every year. It is a joy to do. It is a huge undertaking. We are happy to do it. It really, it matters to us to be a part of a community that really is willing to learn and share and get better at the work that we do to make the world a gentler and kinder place for everyone in it. Thank you so much for joining us. Everything is on the website. All of your questions that we didn't get to will be answered on the website. Please go visit our core website as well. We've got lots of good stuff there. If you had a good time, please, I think the phrase is tweet at us at MR Campaigns. You can find us on every channel there. And please go forth. Have a great day. You'll get the webinar recording tomorrow with all of this good conversation. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Bye.